I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd force open a steel door hidden in the bushes behind an abandoned gas station, but life has a way of pushing you toward moments you never saw coming. My name is Frank, and at 72, I've learned that sometimes the biggest discoveries happen when you're not even looking for them. My dog Rex, a German Shepherd mix with more gray around his muzzle than I care to admit, has been my constant companion for the past 8 years. He's got this way of sensing things before I do, and that October morning when we stumbled upon that door, his hackles were raised long before I understood why. The memory takes me back to my childhood in rural Ohio during the 1950s, when the world still carried the weight of recent war, and every adult seemed to harbor secrets they'd never fully share. My father, Eugene Kowalski, ran a small engine repair shop out of our converted barn, fixing everything from push mowers to farm equipment for folks scattered across 3 counties. The smell of two-stroke oil, cutting fluid, and WD-40 became the cologne of my childhood, seeping into my clothes and skin until I could identify different petroleum products by scent alone. Dad would often work late into the evening, the single bare bulb casting harsh shadows as he coaxed life back into engines that others had declared beyond saving. Frank, he'd say, his weathered hands never pausing in their work, a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he fixes and what he builds. I'd sit on an upturned milk crate, handing him tools and absorbing lessons that went far beyond mechanical repair. He taught me to listen to engines, to feel for the subtle vibrations that indicated worn bearings or timing issues, to trust my instincts when something felt wrong even if I couldn't immediately explain why. These weren't just lessons about machinery, they were lessons about paying attention, about persistence, about looking beneath the surface to find problems that weren't immediately visible. The workshop was always populated by dogs, strays mostly, who seemed drawn to the warmth and the steady presence of a man who never raised his voice. There was Old Blue, a hound mix who'd curl up under the workbench. Patches, a terrier who could somehow sense when Dad was getting frustrated and would appear at his elbow with perfect timing. And my favorite, a shepherd mix named Kaiser, who seemed to understand that a young boy needed a companion who wouldn't judge his awkward attempts at conversation or his tears when the world felt too heavy. Kaiser taught me my first lessons about the silent loyalty dogs offer, how they become witnesses to our lives without judgment or expectation, present through both triumph and sorrow. When my mother died in 1967, cancer taking her with a swiftness that left our family reeling, Dad retreated even deeper into his work. I was 14, caught between childhood and the responsibilities that loss forces upon you too early. The workshop became our refuge, the only place where silence felt comfortable rather than oppressive. Kaiser seemed to understand grief in ways that most people couldn't, sitting with me during those long evenings when Dad worked and I pretended to help, never getting in the way but always present, a warm presence against my leg when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. That's when I first truly understood the profound connection possible between humans and dogs, how they can anchor us when everything else feels unstable. Dad rarely spoke about his own wartime service, but sometimes, late at night when he thought I was asleep, I'd hear him talking to whichever dog was keeping him company. He'd mention names I didn't recognize, places that sounded exotic and dangerous, and occasionally he'd pull out a small wooden box from behind his toolbox and examine contents I was never allowed to see. Years later, I realized these were probably mementos from his time in the Pacific, but as a teenager, they simply added to the sense that all adults carried invisible burdens from a war that had shaped their generation in ways they couldn't fully articulate. The lessons from those formative years stayed with me when I left for community college in 1971, studying business and basic accounting while working part-time at a local Ford dealership. It was there that I met Catherine Sullivan, an education major from the next county over who worked weekends at the parts counter. She had auburn hair that caught light like copper wire, a laugh that seemed to originate somewhere deep in her chest, and a way of listening that made even mundane conversation feel significant. Our courtship unfolded in the comfortable rhythm of small-town life. Friday night football games, Saturday morning coffee at Miller's Diner, Sunday afternoon drives through countryside that stretched endlessly in all directions. When we married in the spring of 1975, we moved to Millfield, Pennsylvania. Town small enough that everyone knew your business, but large enough to support the automotive repair shop I dreamed of opening. Catherine found work teaching third grade at the local elementary school, and together we scraped together enough money to lease a former Texaco station on Route 32, complete with 2 service bays, a small office, and an apartment upstairs that we called home for the first 3 years of our marriage. Those were lean times but happy ones, filled with the satisfaction of building something together, of establishing ourselves in a community that initially viewed us with the polite suspicion small towns reserve for newcomers. Our children arrived in quick succession, Michael in 1977, Sarah in 1979, both of them growing up in that shop, learning to hand me tools before they could properly tie their shoes, their voices mixing with the sounds of air compressors and impact wrenches to create the soundtrack of our family life. Catherine would arrive after school with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and we'd eat lunch together on upturned milk crates while the kids played with whatever friendly dog had wandered into our lives. There was always a dog. It seemed inevitable that strays would gravitate toward the shop, drawn perhaps by the same steady presence that had attracted them to my father's workshop years before. The business grew slowly but steadily, built on word-of-mouth recommendations and the kind of meticulous work that earns customer loyalty. I specialized in the kinds of problems other shops didn't want to tackle: electrical issues that required patience and systematic diagnosis, transmission rebuilds that demanded precision and experience, classic car restorations that called for both mechanical skill and historical research. Catherine managed the books and customer relations with the same patient competence she brought to teaching, somehow making even the most difficult customers feel heard and valued. Our first major test came in 1983 when the recession hit our area particularly hard. The steel mill 20 miles north closed permanently, taking with it nearly a third of our customer base practically overnight. For 6 months, we barely scraped together enough business to pay the rent, let alone support our family. I remember lying awake at night, listening to Catherine's steady breathing beside me, wondering if we'd made a terrible mistake in trying to build a life around a small-town repair shop. It was during this period that Rex's predecessor, a German shepherd named Bear, came into our lives, abandoned by a family forced to move away for work, too proud to ask for help but too responsible to simply turn him loose. Bear seemed to understand that our family was struggling. He appointed himself guardian of the shop, sleeping in the office at night and greeting customers with a dignity that somehow elevated every interaction. Children who were frightened of the garage environment would relax around Bear, and more than once, I saw him gently guide elderly customers away from potentially dangerous areas while I worked. His presence became part of our business identity, and when times were toughest, people would stop by just to visit with him, often remembering at the last minute that they needed some small service or part. The recovery, when it came, felt almost miraculous. A series of referrals from satisfied customers brought new business from neighboring towns, and gradually we built a reputation that extended far beyond Millfield. By the late 1980s, we were busy enough to hire our first employee, Tom Bradley, a young mechanic fresh out of technical school who brought enthusiasm and updated training to complement my experience and intuition. Tom stayed with us for 15 years, eventually leaving to open his own shop 2 counties over, but remaining close enough that we could still refer specialized jobs back and forth. Michael showed early aptitude for mechanical work, spending afternoons and summers in the shop, but his interests gradually shifted toward computers and technology. I was proud, but also slightly disappointed when he chose to study engineering at Penn State rather than staying to eventually take over the business. Sarah followed a different path entirely, drawn to art and literature, eventually earning a teaching degree like her mother and moving to California where she met her husband and started her own family. Their choices were right for them, but they left Catherine and me facing the reality that our carefully built business might not have a next generation to inherit it. The 1990s brought changes that transformed both our personal and professional lives. Catherine was diagnosed with diabetes, requiring careful attention to diet and medication that gradually but persistently limited her energy and mobility. The shop had grown large enough to require constant attention, but I found myself increasingly torn between business responsibilities and Erin's health needs. It was during this period that Bear aged rapidly and passed away, leaving a void in our daily routine that surprised me with its depth. We mourned him like a family member, because that's exactly what he had been. For nearly 2 years, we resisted getting another dog, perhaps because Bear's absence served as a daily reminder of how much Catherine's health was declining. But in 1998, a customer brought us a German Shepherd mix puppy whose mother had been killed by a car. Rex was barely 8 weeks old, all oversized paws and boundless energy, demanding attention and care that forced us out of our growing isolation. Catherine, despite her failing health, took to him immediately, and watching them together during his first year with us brought some of the happiest moments of what would prove to be our final years together. Rex grew into his role as shop dog with natural grace, inheriting Bear's instincts for customer relations, but adding his own unique personality to the mix. Where Bear had been dignified and reserved, Rex was curious and playful, always investigating new smells and sounds, alert to changes in routine or environment that might indicate something important. He seemed particularly attuned to mechanical problems, often alerting me to issues I might have missed, a subtle change in engine sound, the smell of overheated components, or the presence of fluid leaks that weren't immediately visible. Catherine's health continued to decline through the early 2000s, requiring increasingly frequent hospitalizations and medical interventions that gradually drained both our savings and our emotional reserves. The shop sustained us financially, but the demands of running a business while caring for a chronically ill spouse pushed me to physical and emotional limits I hadn't known existed. Rex became my constant companion during this period, seemingly understanding that his human needed support in ways that went beyond simple companionship. He'd sleep beside Catherine's hospital bed during her longer stays, providing comfort that medical professionals couldn't offer. When Catherine passed in 2020, after a final hospitalization that lasted 3 weeks, I felt simultaneously devastated and relieved, devastated by the loss of my life partner, but relieved that her suffering had finally ended. The funeral was small, limited by COVID restrictions that seemed cruelly appropriate for a season of loss and isolation. Rex seemed to understand that she wasn't coming home, spending the first weeks after her death searching the house and shop for traces of her presence, eventually settling into a new routine that acknowledged her absence while maintaining the daily structures that gave our lives meaning. Months following Catherine's death blurred together in a haze of grief and automatic routine. I continued operating the shop, partly because customers depended on me, and partly because work provided structure when everything else felt uncertain. Rex adapted to our new reality with characteristic resilience, but I noticed subtle changes in his behavior, a tendency to stay closer to me during the day, an increased alertness to sounds and smells that might indicate visitors or changes in routine. He seemed to have appointed himself guardian of my emotional well-being, providing companionship when I needed it and space when solitude felt necessary. It was during this period of adjustment that I first began paying attention to the stories that circulated through our small community about forgotten treasures and hidden discoveries. Tom Hendricks, who had retired from the state police and lived 2 houses down from us, would stop by the shop occasionally to visit and share coffee. His conversations often included stories from his law enforcement years, forgotten storage units that yielded valuable collections, estate sales that revealed family secrets, and the surprising number of people who hid important documents or valuable items in locations they assumed would never be searched. "You'd be amazed," Tom would say, scratching Rex behind the ears, "how often valuable stuff gets hidden in plain sight. People during the Depression, during wartime, even folks going through divorces, they stash things in places that seem worthless or abandoned, figuring they'll come back for them when circumstances improve. Problem is, circumstances don't always improve the way people expect." His stories fascinated me, perhaps because they suggested that even in our thoroughly documented modern world, mysteries and discoveries were still possible for ordinary people who paid attention to details others ignored. The first hint that my own life might be touched by such mysteries came during a county auction in late spring of 2023. I'd gone looking for tools and spare parts, the kind of hunting that keeps a small repair business competitive with larger operations that can afford new equipment. Rex came with me, as he always did, content to lie in the shade of the truck, while I examined lots of industrial equipment being sold off from various failed businesses and estate liquidations. There was an old Chevrolet service truck being auctioned, a 1987 model with a custom tool bed that caught my attention not because I needed another vehicle, but because something about it seemed familiar. The auctioneer mentioned that the truck had been sitting behind Mel's gas station for nearly 15 years, ever since the place closed in 2008. Mel Kowalski, no relation despite the shared surname, had run the station for 37 years before health problems forced him to retire without finding a buyer willing to maintain the full-service operation he'd built. The truck had apparently been abandoned by a customer who'd never returned to pay for repairs, eventually becoming part of the property's legal complications when Mel's estate was settled. As I examined the truck more closely, Rex displayed behavior that seemed oddly focused for a casual inspection. Instead of his usual pattern of sniffing randomly and marking territory, he kept returning to specific areas around the vehicle, circling and whining softly in a way that indicated intense interest rather than simple curiosity. When I ran my hand along the tailgate, hoping to assess the condition of the bed liner, I discovered what looked like scratches in the paint, not random damage from normal use, but deliberate marks that spelled out numbers. 1943. The truck ultimately sold for more than I was willing to spend, purchased by Eddie Morrison, a scrap dealer from Lawrence County who specialized in extracting valuable metals from old vehicles and machinery. But something about those scratch numbers stayed with me long after the auction ended. 1943 wasn't a model year for that particular truck, wasn't a part number that made mechanical sense, wasn't random where that would naturally form those specific digits. It was intentional, deliberate, and it suggested meaning that someone had considered important enough to permanently mark into the vehicle's surface. That evening, I found myself driving past the old gas station where the truck had been parked for 15 years. The place embodied the kind of slow decay that affects abandoned commercial properties in small towns, weeds overtaking the parking lot, paint peeling from the service bay doors, windows that reflected empty sky rather than interior activity. Mel's gas station had once been a community gathering place, where farmers would congregate early mornings for coffee and conversation, where teenagers would spend Friday evenings showing off customized cars, where families would stop for gas and snacks during weekend drives through the countryside. Rex was with me during that initial reconnaissance, and as we walked around the property, his behavior became increasingly focused. While I was observing the general deterioration and remembering the station's busier days, he kept returning to a thick patch of honeysuckle and wild blackberry bushes that had grown up behind the service bay. His attention wasn't casual or random. It was the kind of intense focus he displayed when tracking interesting scents or investigating sounds that suggested potential problems. But there were no obvious sounds or smells that would explain his fixation on that particular location. Sleep became increasingly elusive as my mind returned repeatedly to the scratch numbers and Rex's unusual behavior. I'd lie awake thinking about the stories Tom had shared, about the possibility that valuable or important items might be hidden in locations that appeared worthless or abandoned. Catherine used to tease me about my tendency to find mystery in ordinary situations, claiming I could discover conspiracies in grocery lists if I examined them closely enough. But this felt different, more substantial, supported by physical evidence that demanded explanation rather than imagination. During our regular morning walks, Rex began leading me consistently toward the abandoned gas station. What had initially been one destination among many became our primary focus, with Rex displaying increasing urgency as we approached the property line. He'd stop at the same patch of overgrown bushes, circling and whimpering in a way that made my chest tight with anticipation and concern. His behavior was so consistent and focused that I began carrying a small notebook, documenting the specific locations that attracted his attention and the particular sounds and movements he made in response to whatever he was detecting. I attempted to discuss my observations with Michael during one of our weekly phone calls, but the conversation highlighted the growing distance between my daily reality and his busy life in Sacramento. He listened politely as I described the auction, the truck, the scratched numbers, and Rex's behavior, but his response suggested concern about my mental state rather than curiosity about potential discoveries. "Dad," he said, with the gentle but patronizing tone adult children use when they worry about aging parents, "maybe you're spending too much time alone. Have you considered joining some kind of community group, or maybe looking into one of those active senior housing developments?" His suggestion wasn't unreasonable, but it completely missed the point of what I was trying to communicate. I wasn't imagining things or creating drama to fill empty hours. I was observing patterns that suggested something real and significant was hidden in those bushes. Rex's behavior provided independent confirmation that my instincts were correct, but explaining animal behavior to someone who lived across the country and hadn't owned a dog since childhood proved frustratingly difficult. Sarah's response was more supportive, but equally dismissive when I called her the following week. As a teacher, she was accustomed to managing both children and worried parents, and she applied those skills to our conversation with professional competence. "Dad, I think it's wonderful that you and Rex have found something that interests you both. Maybe you could research the history of the gas station, or interview some of the older residents who might remember stories about the place. Even if you don't find hidden treasure, you might discover interesting local history that could become a nice project for the Historical Society." Her suggestions were thoughtful and constructive, but they revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding that had frustrated me during Michael's call. This wasn't about finding a hobby or creating a historical research project. It was about following legitimate evidence that something important was concealed on that property. The scratched numbers weren't random, Rex's behavior wasn't coincidental, and my growing conviction wasn't the product of loneliness or imagination. Tom Hendricks proved a more receptive audience when I finally decided to share my observations with someone who might understand their significance. Over beers on his back porch, with Rex lying contentedly between our chairs, I described the auction, the truck, the numbers, and Rex's consistent behavior around the abandoned gas station. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that indicated he was taking my account seriously rather than simply humoring an elderly neighbor. "You know," he said finally, scratching Rex's ears thoughtfully, "I've seen enough hidden caches over the years to recognize the patterns. People who hide valuable stuff, whether it's documents, money, collectibles, or evidence, they almost always leave markers for themselves. Numbers, initials, symbols that would help them remember the location if they needed to return years later. And they usually choose hiding places that seem worthless or abandoned, places where casual visitors wouldn't think to look." His validation of my observations was tremendously reassuring, but his next comments carried warnings that I hadn't fully considered. "The trick," he continued, "is knowing when curiosity becomes trespassing, and when trespassing becomes discovery that could get you into legal trouble. If something valuable is hidden on that property, it might belong to Mel's estate, or to whoever eventually buys the land, or to the original person who hid it. Finding it doesn't automatically make it yours, and disturbing it without proper authority could create complications you don't want to deal with at your age." Despite Tom's cautionary words, my conviction that something significant was hidden behind the gas station continued to grow stronger. Rex's behavior provided daily confirmation that my instincts were correct, and the mystery of those scratched numbers demanded investigation, regardless of potential legal complications. I began researching the property's history, spending hours at the county courthouse examining deeds, tax records, and building permits that might provide clues about who had access to the land during the period when something might have been concealed there. The research revealed that Mel's gas station had been continuously operated by the Kowalski family since 1952, when Mel's father purchased the property from a widow whose husband had originally planned to develop it for residential housing. The location had strategic value due to its position on Route 32, the main highway connecting Millfield to 3 neighboring counties, but the commercial development had been limited to the gas station and a small convenience store that was added in the 1970s. What intrigued me most was discovering that the property had been briefly leased to the federal government in 1943 for reasons that weren't specified in the public records. That detail, the 1943 date that matched the numbers scratched into the truck, suggested connections that went far beyond coincidence, federal involvement during wartime. It could indicate military use, defense production, or even intelligence operations that might have required secure storage or communication facilities. The possibility that something related to wartime activities was hidden on the property added historical significance to what had started as simple curiosity about Rex's unusual behavior. My research expanded to include conversations with older residents who might remember the property during the 1940s and 1950s. Agnes Morrison, who was 93 and still sharp as a tack, remembered the gas station's early days when it was primarily a service facility for farm equipment rather than automobiles. She also recalled stories about unusual government activity in the area during the war years, though she couldn't provide specific details about what kinds of operations might have been conducted or where they might have been located. There were always rumors, she told me during a visit to her apartment at the senior center, about secret facilities and important visitors who came through town without explaining their business. Most of us figured it was related to the war effort, and we didn't ask too many questions because we understood that some things were supposed to stay secret. But after the war ended, people occasionally mentioned seeing government vehicles at odd locations, and there were stories about equipment or supplies being stored in places that seemed unusual. Her recollections, while not specific enough to confirm my suspicions, provided historical context that supported the possibility of wartime activities that might have left physical evidence behind. The combination of the 1943 date, the federal lease, Agnes's memories, and Rex's consistent behavior created a pattern of evidence that demanded investigation, regardless of legal complications or family concerns about my mental state. The morning I finally decided to take action, Rex's behavior was different from his usual eager energy for our daily walk. Instead of the scattered curiosity he typically displayed, he moved with focused determination, leading me directly to the back of the gas station without pausing to investigate other interesting smells or sounds along the way. The October air was crisp and clear, carrying the smell of decomposing leaves and the faint petroleum odor that never quite disappears from old service stations, even years after they've been abandoned. Rex pushed through the overgrown bushes with purpose I hadn't seen since his younger days, his movements suggesting familiarity with the terrain despite our having only walked this route for a few months. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time, a flash of dull metal partially obscured by years of vine growth and accumulated debris. It wasn't natural, wasn't random, wasn't the kind of casual litter that accumulates around abandoned properties. It was deliberate, substantial, and clearly meant to remain hidden from casual observation. My hands shook as I pulled away the vegetation that had grown over and around the metal surface. What emerged was a steel door, set into what appeared to be a concrete foundation that extended back into the hillside behind the gas station. The door was substantial, commercial or military-grade steel with heavy-duty hinges and a lock mechanism that had long since succumbed to rust and weather. But more importantly, scratched into the metal surface in numbers that matched those I'd found on the truck, were the digits 1943, along with what appeared to be initials. Below the numbers and initials, someone had carved a crude but recognizable drawing of an eagle or large bird in flight, its wings spread wide and its head turned to one side, as if watching for threats or opportunities. The carving was deep enough to have survived decades of weather, and skilled enough to suggest that whoever created it had both artistic ability and sufficient time to work carefully despite what must have been difficult conditions for such detailed work. Rex sat perfectly still beside me as I examined the door and its markings, his attention focused on the metal surface with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was discovery of something that had been deliberately hidden and carefully marked for future reference. The door represented evidence of human activity that had been concealed for at least 70 years, and possibly longer, waiting for someone with sufficient curiosity and persistence to uncover its secrets. The lock mechanism was beyond any hope of restoration, corroded to the point where even the most powerful penetrating oils wouldn't help. The metal had been compromised by decades of moisture and temperature changes, leaving it structurally intact but mechanically useless. I drove home and returned with a comprehensive selection of tools: hacksaws, bolt cutters, pry bars, and portable electric tools that might give me the leverage needed to open the door without damaging whatever might be stored behind it. The work was harder than my 72-year-old frame wanted to handle, requiring frequent breaks and careful attention to avoid injury in the remote location where help wouldn't be immediately available if something went wrong. Rex remained my constant companion throughout the process, occasionally resting his head against my leg in what felt like encouragement, never getting in the way but always present, providing the kind of steady support that only dogs seem capable of offering during moments of physical challenge and emotional uncertainty. When the lock finally gave way after nearly 2 hours of careful work, the door opened with a groan that seemed to come from deep underground, accompanied by the release of air that carried sense of age and preservation. The smell that emerged wasn't unpleasant, but was distinctly different from normal outdoor odors: old paper, leather, metal, and something faintly chemical that might have been preservatives or cleaning solvents used decades earlier to protect whatever was stored inside. Rex sniffed carefully at the threshold but didn't attempt to enter the space, as if he understood that this moment required human judgment and decision-making rather than canine investigation. His behavior suggested respect for whatever lay beyond the door, combined with alertness to potential dangers that might not be immediately obvious to his human companion. I retrieved a flashlight from my truck and directed its beam into the interior, revealing a space that was larger and more sophisticated than anything I had anticipated. The hidden room extended back into the hillside for at least 12 feet, with concrete walls that had been reinforced with metal supports and lined with wooden shelving that showed minimal deterioration despite decades of abandonment. The construction was professional grade, clearly designed for long-term storage of important materials rather than temporary concealment of casual items. Along one wall were metal shelving units holding wooden crates, some still bearing shipping labels and military markings that were partially visible in the flashlight beam. In the center of the room sat a heavy wooden workbench covered with what appeared to be oilcloth, its surface protected from moisture and debris by the careful preparation of whoever had established this hiding place. Beneath the workbench, partially concealed by hanging canvas, I could see the outline of what looked like a metal strongbox or safe, substantial enough to require significant effort to move and sophisticated enough to suggest valuable or sensitive contents. But it was the walls themselves that made my breath catch and my hands tremble as I directed the flashlight beam around the perimeter of the room. They were covered with maps, photographs, and what appeared to be official documents, all protected by glass frames that had somehow survived decades of humidity and temperature changes. The preservation was remarkable, suggesting that whoever had created this hiding place had understood the requirements for long-term document storage and had invested considerable effort in protecting whatever information these materials contained. The maps appeared to show European locations, with detailed markings and annotations that weren't immediately comprehensible but suggested military or intelligence applications. The photographs included both landscapes and portraits, some showing uniformed individuals and others depicting what looked like civilian locations or installations. The documents were too numerous and detailed to examine quickly, but I could see official letterheads, typed reports, and handwritten notes that indicated government or military origins. The strongbox required another trip home for better tools and additional lighting, but when I finally managed to open it several hours later, I understood why someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to hide its contents, and why they had marked the location so carefully for future reference. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be military service records, all bearing the name Robert Lawrence, the RL whose initials were carved into the door. But these weren't ordinary service records or personal memorabilia from a veteran's wartime experience. They detailed covert operations during World War II, complete with photographs of German installations, coded communications between intelligence operatives, maps showing secret facilities and supply routes, and what appeared to be evidence of war crimes that had never been prosecuted or even publicly acknowledged. The documentation was comprehensive, methodical, and professionally organized, suggesting that Robert Lawrence had been involved in intelligence gathering operations of considerable importance and sensitivity. At the bottom of the strongbox, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and sealed with wax to prevent moisture damage, was a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten accounts of missions behind enemy lines. The entries were detailed and systematic, recording dates, locations, personnel involved, and operational outcomes with the precision of someone who understood that these records might someday be crucial evidence in legal or historical proceedings. The handwriting was clear and confident, suggesting education and experience with official documentation. As I read through the journal entries, a picture emerged of Robert Lawrence as an intelligence operative who had been tasked with gathering information about Nazi activities in occupied Europe, specifically focusing on the theft and concealment of artwork, gold, and other valuables stolen from Jewish families and resistance organizations. His accounts described locations where such items had been hidden, names of collaborators who had assisted in the thefts, and detailed maps showing routes used to transport stolen goods to secure storage facilities. Rex remained my steady companion as I spent the next several hours carefully examining each document, photograph, and journal entry. His presence provided both comfort and security as I absorbed the implications of what I was discovering. Some materials were in English, others in German or French, but the overall narrative was clear. Robert Lawrence had gathered evidence of systematic theft and murder that extended far beyond the war crimes that had been prosecuted at Nuremberg and other post-war trials. The photographs were particularly disturbing, showing not only stolen artwork and looted gold, but also the faces of individuals who had participated in these crimes, some in German uniforms, others in civilian clothing, all carefully identified with names, ranks, and locations that would have made post-war prosecution possible if the evidence had been available to prosecutors. Many of these individuals would have been relatively young during the war years, meaning they could potentially still be alive in 2023, living under assumed identities or in countries that hadn't pursued war criminals with the same intensity as others. The locations described in Lawrence's journal were equally significant, detailing hiding places for stolen artwork and gold that had never been recovered by post-war Allied investigations. His maps included precise coordinates for sites in France, Germany, Poland, and other occupied territories where valuable items had been concealed, often in locations that would have been inaccessible to official recovery teams during the chaotic post-war period when such investigations were being conducted. As I continued reading, I discovered that Lawrence's intelligence gathering had extended beyond simple documentation of theft and murder. He had also recorded evidence of ongoing Nazi networks that were planning to continue their activities after Germany's defeat, including escape routes for high-ranking officials, hidden funding sources for future operations, and contact information for sympathizers in neutral countries who were prepared to assist in post-war activities. The scope and detail of Lawrence's work suggested that he had been operating at a very high level of intelligence gathering, with access to information that would have been extremely valuable to allied prosecutors and intelligence agencies. The question that troubled me as I examined his carefully preserved evidence was why these materials had been hidden rather than turned over to appropriate authorities at the end of the war. The answer appeared in the final entries of Lawrence's journal, dated in early 1947. He described growing concerns about the safety of witnesses and the compromised nature of some intelligence operations, specifically mentioning instances where evidence had been suppressed or investigators had been threatened to prevent prosecution of particular individuals. His entries suggested that powerful interests were working to protect certain war criminals, and that turning over his evidence through official channels might result in its disappearance rather than its use in legitimate prosecutions. Lawrence's final entries revealed his decision to hide the evidence until such time as it could be safely and effectively used to pursue justice. He had apparently chosen the location behind the gas station because of family connections. His brother-in-law had owned the property and had agreed to allow the construction of the hidden storage facility. The plan was to return after a few years, when the post-war political situation had stabilized, and turn the evidence over to prosecutors who could be trusted to use it appropriately. But Robert Lawrence had died in a car accident in late 1947, only months after hiding the evidence that I was now discovering more than 75 years later. His death had left the carefully preserved documentation locked away, known only to a few family members who had either died or forgotten the significance of the hidden room. The scratched numbers on the truck had probably been left by someone who knew about the hiding place, but lacked either the ability or the courage to retrieve its contents. The weight of this discovery settled on me as I carefully repacked everything exactly as I had found it. This wasn't simply historical memorabilia or family documents that could be treated as personal property. These materials represented evidence of crimes against humanity, information that could still affect living people, and documentation that belonged to history rather than to any individual finder. The responsibility for deciding what to do with Lawrence's evidence was far beyond anything I had anticipated when Rex first led me to investigate the overgrown bushes. But I also recognized that the decision couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The documents were deteriorating despite Lawrence's careful preservation efforts, and the longer they remained hidden, the less likely it became that they could be used to achieve the justice he had hoped to facilitate. Some of the war criminals identified in his records were certainly dead by now, but others might still be alive, and the locations of stolen artwork and gold were still relevant to families and institutions that had never recovered their losses. Rex seemed to sense the gravity of the moment as I secured the strongbox and prepared to reseal the room temporarily while I decided on the appropriate course of action. His behavior was calm but alert, staying close as I worked but never interfering, providing the kind of steady companionship that allowed me to think clearly despite the overwhelming nature of what I had discovered. Together, we had uncovered evidence that could rewrite portions of World War II history and potentially deliver justice that had been delayed for more than 7 decades. The drive home was filled with conflicting emotions and competing priorities. Part of me wanted to share the discovery immediately, to contact historians and law enforcement agencies that could properly evaluate and act on Lawrence's evidence. But another part of me recognized that hasty action could jeopardize the very justice that Lawrence had risked his life to document. The wrong approach could result in the evidence being buried again, this time permanently, or falling into the hands of people who might use it for personal gain rather than historical truth. That night I barely slept, my mind racing through the possibilities and responsibilities that my discovery had created. Rex seemed equally restless, frequently changing positions and occasionally moving to check the doors and windows, as if sensing that our lives had fundamentally changed. By morning, I had reached a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I would contact federal authorities who had the expertise and resources to properly evaluate Lawrence's evidence and take appropriate action based on what they found. The call to the FBI field office in Pittsburgh was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. The agent who answered seemed initially skeptical when I described finding hidden documents related to World War II, probably assuming I was either confused or trying to sell some kind of military memorabilia. But when I mentioned Nazi gold, war crimes documentation, and evidence of ongoing criminal networks, the tone of the conversation changed dramatically. Within 4 hours, 2 federal agents were sitting in my living room, listening as I described the discovery and examining the photographs I had taken of the hidden room and its contents. Rex watched them carefully throughout the interview, not hostile, but clearly alert to the presence of strangers who represented unknown changes to our established routine. Agent Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that inspired confidence, explained that documents like Lawrence's occasionally surface during estate settlements or property transfers, but that the completeness and preservation of what I had described made it potentially significant for ongoing investigations. Agent Collins, her partner, was more focused on the legal and procedural aspects of the discovery. He explained that anything found on private property became legally complicated, requiring careful documentation and coordination with property owners, local authorities, and potentially international agencies if the evidence suggested crimes committed in other countries. The process would be thorough, professional, and probably lengthy, but it would ensure that any action taken would be legally sound and historically accurate. The excavation and documentation process took nearly a week, with federal agents, historians from the Holocaust Memorial Museum, art recovery specialists, and legal experts carefully cataloging every item in Robert Lawrence's hidden cache. I remained present for most of the process, both because the agents needed my detailed account of the discovery, and because Rex refused to leave the area while strangers were handling what he apparently still considered our responsibility. The specialists confirmed that several pieces of artwork described in Lawrence's journal were still listed as missing by international recovery organizations, and that at least 2 individuals identified in his photographs as war criminals were still alive, living under assumed names in South America. The intelligence networks he had documented had apparently continued operating well into the 1950s, and some of the contact information he had preserved was still relevant to ongoing investigations of Nazi sympathizers and war criminal networks. But it was the human stories emerging from Lawrence's work that affected me most profoundly. His documentation included detailed records of 12 Jewish families who had hidden valuables before being deported to concentration camps, complete with maps showing exactly where items had been concealed and photographs of the families who had entrusted him with information they hoped would eventually help recover their possessions. In most cases, no family members had survived the camps, but the locations Lawrence had recorded were still accessible and could potentially yield discoveries that would honor the memory of families whose stories had been lost to history. Within weeks of my discovery becoming known to appropriate authorities, recovery teams were being dispatched to European locations that had waited 77 years to give up their secrets. The first successful recovery came from a basement in Prague, where Lawrence's notes led investigators to a cache of jewelry, documents, and photographs that had belonged to the Moravec family, who had been murdered at Auschwitz in 1943. The items were turned over to the Czech government for eventual display in a Holocaust Memorial Museum, ensuring that the Moravec family's story would be preserved and honored. Similar recoveries followed in France, Germany, and Poland, each success validating Lawrence's meticulous documentation and bringing closure to stories that had remained unfinished for nearly 8 decades. The international cooperation required for these recovery efforts demonstrated how one person's courage and foresight could continue affecting lives and preserving history long after their own death, and how seemingly small acts of discovery and integrity could have consequences far beyond what anyone might anticipate. The media attention was initially overwhelming, with news organizations from around the world wanting to interview the grandfather and his dog who solved a World War II mystery. I gave a few interviews, but mostly I let the federal agents and museum experts handle the publicity, preferring to focus on the human stories that were emerging rather than the sensational aspects of the discovery. Rex handled the attention better than I did, seeming to understand that all the strangers and cameras were somehow connected to the important work we had accidentally stumbled into. Letters began arriving from around the world within months of the story becoming public. Families whose relatives had been mentioned in Lawrence's documentation reached out to thank me for preserving evidence of their ancestors' experiences. Holocaust survivors and their descendants expressed gratitude that someone had cared enough to follow through on a discovery that could have been easily ignored or mishandled. Museum curators and historians shared information about how Lawrence's evidence was filling gaps in the historical record and enabling new understanding of wartime activities that had remained mysterious for decades. One letter particularly moved me, from a woman named Rachel Goldman in Montreal, whose grandmother's family had been among those documented by Lawrence. She explained that her family had given up hope of ever learning what had happened to precious items hidden before deportation, and that Lawrence's notes had led to the recovery of photographs and documents that were now the only surviving record of relatives who had been murdered in the camps. Your integrity in turning these materials over to proper authorities, she wrote, means that my children and grandchildren will be able to see faces and read words from family members they would never have known existed. Similar expressions of gratitude arrived from families whose stolen artwork had been recovered, from historians whose research had been advanced by Lawrence's documentation, and from law enforcement agencies that had been able to close cold cases using evidence that had been preserved for more than 7 decades. Each letter reinforced my conviction that following Rex's instincts and investigating that hidden door had been exactly the right decision, regardless of the personal inconvenience and public attention it had brought into our quiet lives. The abandoned gas station property was eventually purchased by the county and developed into a small memorial and research center focused on World War II intelligence operations and the ongoing effort to recover stolen artwork and document war crimes. Robert Lawrence's story is featured prominently in the exhibits, but equal attention is given to the importance of ordinary citizens who recognize when they've stumbled upon something larger than themselves and who have the integrity to handle such discoveries appropriately. A bronze plaque near the entrance reads, "Sometimes the most important discoveries are made by those who simply pay attention to what others ignore." Below it, a smaller plaque acknowledges Rex's role in the discovery, noting that the loyalty and instincts of a faithful companion can lead to revelations that change our understanding of history. Rex was present for the dedication ceremony, accepting attention from visitors with the dignity that had characterized his behavior throughout our adventure. The research center has become a destination for families seeking information about relatives who disappeared during the war, for historians researching intelligence operations that remained classified for decades, and for law enforcement agencies investigating ongoing cases related to war crimes and stolen artwork. The work that began with Robert Lawrence's courage and continued with my accidental discovery has created an ongoing legacy that continues helping people find answers and achieve justice nearly 80 years after the events that initiated the process. These days, Rex and I still take our morning walks, but they're quieter now, less driven by mystery, and more appreciative of the simple pleasure of companionship and fresh air. He's slowing down, as am I, but the bond forged during those intense days of discovery has deepened our partnership in ways that go beyond normal pet ownership. We both learned that curiosity, when combined with courage and integrity, can reveal truths that change lives long after the original discoverers are gone. The experience taught me that paying attention to details others ignore isn't just a useful habit. It's a responsibility that comes with living in a world where important stories remain hidden, waiting for someone who cares enough to investigate and someone wise enough to know what to do with what they find. Rex understood this instinctively, leading me to discoveries I never could have made alone and providing the companionship necessary to handle responsibilities I never could have anticipated. I think about Robert Lawrence often, wondering if he ever imagined that his careful documentation would eventually help families find closure 7 decades after their losses, or that evidence he risked his life to gather would continue facilitating justice long after everyone involved in the original crimes had died or disappeared. His decision to hide rather than destroy sensitive information was itself an act of faith, faith that someday someone would care enough to look for the truth, and someone would be wise enough to handle that truth appropriately. Rex and I happen to be those someones, but I suspect the real heroes are the families who never stopped hoping that their stories weren't truly lost, the investigators who continued pursuing justice despite decades of obstacles, and the individuals like Robert Lawrence who chose to preserve truth rather than ignore it when preservation required personal risk and sacrifice. Our role was simply to pay attention, follow instincts, and maintain integrity when faced with discoveries that were larger than our personal lives. The responsibilities that came with our discovery extended far beyond the initial excitement of finding hidden treasure or solving historical mysteries. Every decision we made had implications for real people, families seeking closure, survivors seeking justice, historians seeking truth, and law enforcement agencies seeking evidence that could still affect living individuals. The weight of that responsibility was sometimes overwhelming, but Rex's steady presence provided the emotional support necessary to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was convenient. Looking back on the entire experience, I'm struck by how many small details had to align perfectly for Lawrence's evidence to be discovered and properly handled. If the county auction had been scheduled differently, if Rex had been less persistent in his investigation of the overgrown bushes, if I had been less curious about scratched numbers on an old truck, if Tom hadn't provided encouragement rather than discouragement, if the federal agents hadn't taken my call seriously, any of these variables could have resulted in the evidence remaining hidden indefinitely. The timing also proved crucial in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Advanced DNA analysis techniques now available to investigators have enabled positive identification of remains found at some of the locations described in Lawrence's journal, providing closure to families who had wondered about the fate of relatives for nearly 80 years. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies has made it possible to coordinate recovery efforts across multiple countries, ensuring that stolen artwork and documents are returned to appropriate institutions rather than disappearing into private collections. Perhaps most importantly, public awareness of Holocaust history and ongoing war crimes investigations has created an environment where evidence like Lawrence's is valued and acted upon rather than dismissed as ancient history with no contemporary relevance. The work of organizations like the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the World Jewish Congress has ensured that discoveries like ours connect with existing research and ongoing recovery efforts rather than becoming isolated curiosities. Rex's role in all of this continues to amaze me. His instincts led us to evidence that had remained hidden for 75 years, and his steady companionship provided the emotional support necessary to handle the responsibilities that came with our discovery. He seemed to understand from the beginning that we were involved in something important, and his behavior throughout the entire process reflected a dignity and wisdom that went far beyond ordinary animal intelligence. The recognition Rex received for his part in the discovery included several awards from animal welfare organizations and a formal commendation from the FBI for outstanding service in support of historical justice. While he obviously couldn't understand the significance of these honors, he seemed to appreciate the attention and the additional treats that came with being a celebrated hero. More importantly, his story has inspired other people to pay attention to their pets' unusual behaviors and to investigate situations that might seem ordinary but could reveal extraordinary discoveries. The changes in our daily routine have been mostly positive, though sometimes I miss the quiet anonymity we enjoyed before becoming known as the discoverers of the Lawrence cache. Visitors to the Memorial Center occasionally stop by the shop to meet Rex and hear firsthand accounts of how we found the hidden room. School groups working on Holocaust education projects have interviewed us several times, and their thoughtful questions remind me how important it is for younger generations to understand that history isn't just something that happened to other people in distant times and places. Rex handles the attention with characteristic grace, seeming to understand that our story has educational value that goes beyond personal experience. Children particularly respond to the idea that a dog's instincts led to important historical discoveries, and teachers often use our experience to discuss the importance of paying attention to details, following through on curiosity, and handling significant discoveries with appropriate integrity and responsibility. The financial rewards from our discovery were minimal, which was exactly as it should have been. We received no payment for turning Lawrence's evidence over to appropriate authorities, no percentage of the value of recovered artwork, no compensation for the time and effort involved in cooperating with various investigations. But the personal satisfaction of knowing that families found closure, that justice was served even decades after crimes were committed, and that history was preserved rather than lost, proved far more valuable than any monetary compensation could have been. Rex and I learned that some discoveries are too important to be treated as personal property, and that the real reward comes from knowing you've done the right thing when faced with responsibilities larger than your own immediate interests. The experience reinforced lessons my father had taught me decades earlier about the difference between what we own and what we're temporarily entrusted to protect, and about the importance of recognizing when individual actions can have consequences that extend far beyond personal circumstances. Have you ever had a moment when following your instincts, despite what others thought, led you to something that changed not just your life, but the lives of others? I'd love to hear about it, because I believe these stories of ordinary people making extraordinary discoveries are more common than we realize. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply pay attention to the signals around us, whether they come from a faithful dog's unusual behavior, scratched numbers on an old truck, or the feeling that something hidden is waiting to be found. Rex taught me that curiosity combined with courage and integrity can reveal truths that matter long after the discoverers are gone, and that the greatest discoveries often happen not when we're actively search. In G for treasure, but when we're simply living our lives with enough awareness to notice what others walk past every day. The steel door that everyone mocked us for forcing open became a portal not just to hidden history, but to understanding that each of us has the potential to become custodians of stories that need to be preserved, truths that need to be revealed, and justice that needs to be served, even when that service comes decades after we thought the opportunity had passed.